Conservationist in the Range Agriculture and Forestry program in Department of Natural Resources for the tribes here. I've worked for the tribes for going on 7 years now, and have gotten a lot of hands-on experience with the uplands and first foods through a lot of contract management and also land management plans through our program, so future planning and things. A lot of what our program works with at its core is the federal Indian trust responsibility, which is a legally enforceable obligation on the part of the United States government to protect treaty rights, land, assets, resources. So a lot of what my program ends up working with is that compromise between sustainable land use and management and a few capitalistic opportunities on the landscape. So using the land for agriculture and grazing purposes while still maintaining the natural resource values in perpetuity. And specifically in range ag and forestry, we work with those women's foods, the roots and the berries. Wildlife is handled as a separate program, which is also considered an upland food. But in our program, we deal with roots and berries primarily. So our program mission is to protect, restore, and enhance first foods through stewardship of range, ag, and forested lands to provide cultural, ecological, economic, and social benefits for the CTUIR. In accomplishing this mission, the Range, Ag, and Forestry program encourages stakeholders to conserve, develop, and use natural resources for long-term sustainability. So what that frequently looks like in our management actions out on the landscape are activities such as pre-commercial thinning, timber harvest, prescribed fire. Cheryl's shop does a lot of invasive species management. We do prescribed grazing for targeted grazing. We monitor and inventory the plants out on the range. And then within the ag land, a lot of that looks like cover cropping or no-till farming as a kind of preservative management actions. So I'm including a list of some common upland first foods. It's by no means completely exhaustive, but these are just some examples of first foods where we would be out on the landscape and we may note areas where they're either abundant or absent and start asking management questions about, you know, why do they prefer this area? Why don't they prefer this other area? And kind of frame our management actions around making sure that we're providing good habitat for these root and berry plants. So to introduce some of our work, I'm just going to do a suite of 4 different upland first foods, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about my climate monitoring project. But as an example of a root species, we have Cous, with some of the management implications that we found on the landscape being historic overgrazing leading to decreased abundance and also decreased habitat suitability for this species. Part of that comes from the introduction of invasive annual grasses on the landscape and the range. And unfortunately, what those do is create this thick thatch layer that prevents the ground nesting pollinators from being able to have suitable habitat and fertilize the first foods, which is this whole cascading event of decreasing abundance through decreasing other beneficial species that help them. And we also look at, you know, erosion problems on the landscape that decrease habitat suitability. In this of Oregon, we are more prone to landslides. They are a natural event, but there's management actions that you can do to kind of prevent that from happening, like having deep-rooted native grasses. Humus is another one of the first foods that we noted on the landscape, especially last year when we got all of those beneficial rains. However, when land is plowed and converted to farm or overgrazed as pasture, you lose some of the suitable habitat. An interesting thing to note with my NRCS archaeologist as scale reference, you can see her kind of standing on a little bit of a rise on the landscape, which we call a biscuit. And the camas is actually growing down in that swale below her. And we have a lot of these biscuits up on the foothills. And when we get those big rain events, the water kind of soaks in there where the camas really likes it. But there's areas just adjacent to this that have been plowed over for farming where the camas is non-existent. Between the land conversion factor and then climate change and unpredictable precipitation patterns, those are some impacts that we're seeing to habitat suitability for camas. Huckleberry is the one that I work closest with through my weather monitoring project. Some of the management implications and actions that we have, as I mentioned with the pre-commercial thinning and timber harvest, we use that as a means to kind of open up the understory in the forest so that the huckleberry can spread and grow while still providing enough shade for it that it doesn't get burned out. However, what we notice with climate change is that kind of the temperature and the precipitation suitability for huckleberry seems to be decreasing. We'll get a really quick warm up in the summer and it's hot and it'll almost fry the berries off the plants. And then you have the additional problem that phenophase triggers are unknown, which is a fancy way of saying scientists don't know what temperature and precipitation pattern leads to the first leaf setting, that leads to the first flowers, that leads to the berry ripening. So a lot of our work comes up to monitoring those weather patterns and then also noting the timing of those events on the berry plant. And then finally, a riparian berry plant that we have seen lose a lot of habitat suitability are currants. I put this drone flight picture as an example of some of the landscape alteration. There are areas across the flats that have the streams completely plowed over the top of. So the riparian area has been completely removed and turned into farmland, which obviously takes away habitat. But then also currant is a species that needs water, but needs to not get flooded out and washed away in large flood events. So when we have those large rain on top of snow flood events like we've been getting the last couple of springs, that's the kind of event that could scour away currant plants out of the riparian. So I'm just briefly going to introduce some of Cheryl's work. She's going to go into a lot more detail on it on her talk on the 26th. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, she's done work with Bee Ecology Consulting to research and document pollinator use on first food species. And their research seems to indicate that these plants, especially Cous and Camas and some of the other species that they've looked at, are dependent on pollinators in order to reproduce. So what my program looks at is making sure we're providing suitable habitat, not just for the plants, but also for the pollinators that the plants need. And Cheryl has also been working with Oregon State University out of La Grande on some celery and roots monitoring. Historically, within the range program, when we do our inventory of plants out on the landscape, that is a process that's undergone in early to mid-summer and has historically been mostly used for calculating how much forage is available on the landscape. We do also have our contractors document presence and absence of first food species as well as noxious invasive plant species. But what we find is that due to the timing of those inventory projects, they're actually missing some of the earlier foods and forbs that are out on the landscape that are starting to grow and bloom, say, right now. So Cheryl's work has been to go along and improve those inventory efforts at an earlier time. So finally, what I'll talk a little bit about is my Huckleberry phenology monitoring project. It was funded in 2018 with a grant from the BIA under their Tribal Resilience Program. And what we and Colleen wrote the grant for was kind of based on this article by Janet Prevey and Connie Harrington out of the Forest Service, where they did a computer modeling effort based on the predicted climate change scenarios to map changes in habitat suitability for huckleberry plants. So in boxes B and D, you'll see changes in predicted habitat 50 years from now. I guess it's only 30 years from now to mid-century. And then C and E are changes to habitat suitability 100 years from now at the end of the century. So on B and C, that's under a mild climate change scenario, and D and E are under the RCP 8.5, the aggressive. And then similarly within that modeling project, they also did predictions for how much the timing of berry ripening is going to change. And they predict it could advance an average 36 days by the end of the century. So this speaks to what Colleen introduced earlier about some of that plant migration need and what we're looking at for adaptation, adaptive management of the species into the future, and what we might need to do. Do we need to start propagating it in different areas? You know, unfortunately, one of the hardest hit areas they're predicting is going to be over in the Lawas, with that complete loss of the subalpine type up there. So more locally, we need this information for that adaptive management. We need to expand our knowledge on huckleberry habitat requirements. We need additional knowledge for adaptation and resilience planning. And we're trying to begin to collect trend data and document the temperature and precipitation regimes over the years and what that looks like year to year for the berry. So what the grant that I was awarded purchased was 4 weather stations, weather monitoring stations, I should say. And we installed 3 stations and kept the 4th as equipment and maintenance. But what those weather stations have on them are measuring temperature, precipitation, snowfall, soil temperature, soil moisture, solar radiation, wind speed. And then we also purchased some trail cams that are set to take pictures each day. And at some point, I will need a student intern to go through all of those pictures and say when the flowers set, when the berries set, and when the leaves set each year, so that we can compare that back to what the weather was when those events occurred. I have 3 sites, a low elevation, a mid elevation, and a high elevation. And like I said, the phenology is monitoring leaf set, flowering, ripening, leaf fall. First low elevation station was constructed in December 2020. The second site went up in June of 2021. That's our range technician installing the snow capture funnel on top of the precipitation gauge. Completely OSHA approved manner. Our high elevation site was installed shortly after the mid elevation site, and we're really noticing some snowfall limitations at this site. Right now, that site's buried in about 8 or 9 feet of snow, and it's going to be an equipment maintenance adventure this spring when I can finally get in there. And finally, a lot of this work was supported with the CTUIR Office of Information Technology. They purchased a server for storage of all of this data, and then also generated a user interface and reports where I can log in from my desk computer and see what the stations are reporting each day, because those stations are transmitting the data up to the NOAA GOES satellites and then pumping that back down into our server. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions and discussion.
Thank you. So I think we'll bounce question in the room to question online, and then we also have a poll for you guys as part of this, and so I'm going to launch that. But I think we are now firmly in our discussion period. Thank you, Amanda, for your presentation. Yeah, if you please love whatever way you want. So if you want to turn your camera on, if you have questions online, you can use the raise hand button that we talked about earlier, or you're welcome to unmute yourself. We have questions in the room. Questions online. All right, we're gonna, we have one question. So Linda wants to know how from conventional tillage to no-till.
Well, a lot of that transition has happened 10 to 15 years ago, honestly, and that came from the farmers seeing the benefit of purchasing the new equipment. So I still have a couple of holdout farmers that are not completely no-till, but most of the farmers have seen the benefits of going to no-till. They kind of realized that on their own. But how I assist everybody else is just providing data. A lot of that comes from Stuart's work up at the Ag Research Station, and other farmers' experience. You know, farmers listen to other farmers better than they listen to scientists sometimes, but we still report on, you know, what we think the benefits that they'll see to their operation are.
So we've launched the poll and we've got those questions up here online. It really relates to what Amanda was talking about earlier. We're hoping this might inspire some of those conversations. So for anybody in the room who has done this out on the land. And so we'd love to know if species are ready later than they used to be, ready earlier, which is what research suggests that they would be. Plants found in new locations, reduced abundance or increased abundance in existing locations. Are plants being crowded out in the way that Amanda described, that thatch kind of around the culturally significant species? Are plants damaged, sun scorched? Do they have spots on them that they didn't used to? Is there soil degradation happening around the plant? So I know that a lot of you do field work. I would love out there on the land. And online as well, I would love to have you guys. Lindsay, you're on camera, so I might pick on you. No, you don't feel like sharing? Okay. Thank you for being here regardless. Chat. Sorry, we just ended up kicking ourselves off of our own program, which is fun. Hybrid meeting. Althea, we would love to hear from you.
I was wondering why everybody froze.
Yep, technical issues.
Okay. So I have a question in the chat, and then I also have a follow-up. I was curious after Amanda's presentation, because she mentioned some potential student interns and whatnot to do data recording. Will you guys in the future have a study that perhaps looks at improved first foods populations to herd populations like the mule deers or the elk? I know the forest part of your program reported that the burns have resulted in improving herd access to the grasses and whatnot. So we're getting healthier herds because of our burn management. But I guess the correlation between the plants and the deer in general and the elk in general, are we going to have a study that maybe looks at that?
I haven't heard talk about that kind of direct correlation, but I would say that when we go out and do those rangeland inventory projects, like I mentioned, and document available forage and suitable forage, you could take that same information. You know, often we're using it to dictate how many cattle we allow on the landscape, but that forage is there for the deer and the elk. And when we do our cattle allocations, we are taking that forage data and first allocating to deer and elk and horses on the landscape. And what is left after that is then provided for the cattle. But in terms of taking it and looking at a direct benefit to the deer and elk species, I haven't seen that yet, but that'd be interesting.
That's great to know. The follow-up I had was in the chat for the questions she's asking. There was other, and I've discussed this with Cheryl already, and Colleen and I have talked about it, but observations out there gathering that there's either more people gathering our first foods or people are gathering them at the wrong time, which is impacting how much can be gathered on certain sites. So some sites are getting overgathered while others, they're harder to get to, and they also require different timing, especially if they're higher in elevations. But I am noticing that, and considering putting out there as a part of these observations with shrinking resources that we might need to start gatherer protocols, and also listening to the Homeland project up there at Enterprise. It might be something for us to utilize through their office as well, because yeah, I'm seeing the impacts of people gathering either too early or too late, and the plants aren't able to populate. And then they don't gather them correctly either, like with the rakes. Some people actually use rakes, and some of them are tribal people too, which is really frustrating because I didn't think we'd ever have to do this, and I don't want to, but people are going out gathering, and I don't know, they're causing harm, I guess. And your thoughts would be curious on that.
Cheryl, do you have any thoughts on ideas of protocols and management? And that was kind of something that I had touched on in the climate adaptation plan, in that section of research and regulatory understanding. So E on page 89 of the climate adaptation plan kind of addresses what you're describing, Althea. That we have people who their hearts are in the right place and they're excited to be out there communing with the first foods, but there may not have been that passage of knowledge for whatever reason of the right timing. You're right. I've heard of people going out and digging the like OCHA, the bare root at the wrong time of year and really disturbing it from its slumber. And so that is something that we mentioned in the climate adaptation plan. And so the idea is that if it's mentioned in the climate adaptation plan, we can apply for funding, project funding for those kinds of things. And so that is listed in the plan. And I'd love to have long-term conversations with RAF and wildlife about maybe how do we get these understandings to the community as at a large rather than in silos based on family knowledge.
Yeah, also, I also serve on Health Commission, and that was brought up at one of our recent meetings that we have those gatherer, we bring people out on the land as a part of Yellow Hawk, and we partner with, usually we partner with the tribes on it, but I know they've done some excursions without the tribe. And there's a level of responsibility as a health commissioner I have that, wait a minute, we're bringing people out on the land and showing them where these plants are, but we're not telling them or teaching them what we were taught. And we're missing a piece of that lesson. So people don't know when to stop gathering, or the unwritten rule that you don't ever gather an entire huckleberry patch out. You only take half and you leave the rest. And there's huckleberry patches that are just being gathered completely and none are being left to propagate or for the bears. So those are what I'm talking about. And we do have a responsibility and we agreed at Health Commission that we should do that, have some gathering protocols when we do host these excursions for our patients and community members.
So I see that we have a hand up online and we'll get to you in a second, but Cheryl, I know you wanted to say something.
Althea responded to it. I think that it's not necessarily staff's responsibility to teach tribal members how to gather. It's up to tribal members to teach other tribal members. And I think the excursions that Winix is doing is a perfect opportunity to go out there and when they're out there to teach them the proper way to gather. Also going and gather with the longhouse is another way to learn the way to gather. And I know some families, there's a disconnect and they weren't taught these things. You know, there's lots of plants out there, and there's proper way to gather, and a lot of us may not gather all of them, but I think it's up to the tribal membership to, you know, teach tribal members how to gather and those protocols that are necessary. You know, the right timing, you know, waiting till after feast to gather, then you're not gathering too early. Not over harvesting. I've heard of a tribal member over harvesting couch, and it was, you know, upsetting, but it's how do you just have to teach and share your knowledge with other tribal members so that they're not over harvesting, they're not harvesting, and proper to taking care of their first foods. It's a process, and that's the hardest part. The digging is the easy part. The gathering of the berries is the easy part. It's a process, and that takes a lot of time. But I agree with Althea that this is a teaching opportunity, and that we can hopefully address, you know, with outreach of the excursions, and also if others are going out and gathering with the longhouse, that this information will be shared.
Based on some of the responses from that 2020 food systems assessment, those cultural excursions are the primary way that a lot of people gather first foods. And so if we can have that kind of education, that actually will reach a number of people that will continue to do those good practices. So I saw that Thea had your hand up. I would love for you to unmute yourself. Share with us, please.
Hi, I'm Thea. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. I'm with the Washington Native Plant Society up in Richland, and we would like to know how we can help.
Wonderful. We have plant people initial responses to that.
I guess just reach out to us and we can discuss that further.
If you want to drop your email, if you're comfortable putting it in the chat, it's not going to go further than the like 15 people that are here. We would be happy.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks for being here. Are there any other discussion points that were spurred? I know that sometimes when we're out there looking at the huckleberries, there are like red spots on them. Damage, sun scorch, insects on the plants while you're out there?
I've noticed the sun scorching of the leaves, that's when we've had those really hot years. There's also a fungus out there where you see like the whiteberries, a mummy. You'll run into that occasionally. And it varies from year to year depending on the weather conditions, you know, whether we have large berries, small berries, no berries. So it's really variable every year.
Yeah. And that is part of the challenge that we expect with like climate crisis impacts is it's not going to be this standard linear thing where it's every year is going to be, you know, heavy rain, rain on snow, extreme heat. We're going to have years that are good years where we don't have so much smoke, where the heat is a little bit less. And then we're going to have really severe years. We're going to have everything in between. So those nice calm ramp ups and downs in the season that we're so used to historically, those are going to get a lot of wiggle in how they manifest every year. So adaptive management really is how we do this. And so this is, I guess, a question that I have maybe vaguely for RAF and wildlife is, what do you do that you're considering that is not just rigid? This is something that I think we hear, especially in like hunter situations where the start date is rigid and the end date is rigid, and it doesn't necessarily match up with what's available on the land. So if that's true for what range and forestry are looking at as well, we do talk a little bit to the changing conditions and how we might be flexible with that.
Well, we do write that flexibility into our grazing management plans. So for example, this year, we've delayed cattle turnout on our lower units because the soil is still too wet. And if we turn them out now, there's going to be a lot of increased erosion from hoof action out on the landscape. So we set them back, I think, a week or a week and a half at least already. But we'll also take similar actions in dry years. If we notice that there's a decrease in forage, we'll ask the producers to pull their livestock from the landscape before they can overgraze. Because one of our major goals in our grazing protocols is that we're trying to have the cattle graze early in the season, mostly on those invasive annual grasses, and then pull them off in time for the native perennial grasses to have the rest of the soil moisture and the rest of the summer to grow and recover. Landscape.
Have an example, Lindsay?
I did, yeah. So a lot of the habitat management work the wildlife program does is, I would say, directly controlled by the environment. So things like planting, say we're planting sagebrush, we're planting it early in the winter so that those plants have a long time to take advantage of that winter moisture, so that they can survive the summer drought, for example. So we have other planting efforts, but we also do things like thinning and prescribed fire, that are also very much controlled by what the weather's doing, what the fuels are doing.
Yeah, I think that that's very true, especially if you're a person that works on the land, you understand that the land really sets the calendar. The problem and the tension that I think we're experiencing is when the land and the rules are not together. So for me, what you guys are doing is amazing. What needs to be updated is the policy, both for the tribe, for the state, and for the country. Althea, you have your hand up. Anybody else want to say anything? Althea, we'd love to hear from you.
No, sorry, I just forgot to.
Oh, no, Althea.
Yeah, I'm Althea, Thea. Very similar. My question was to the staff. I've got to travel to, I always call them different homelands, but like I've got to travel to tropical environments, and I always go there and I reflect back on home, and it makes me appreciate home a little more. And also it just makes me think of home, and I compare and contrast. I was wondering if you guys could reflect on any of your travels, and if you do that when you visit somewhere else and it makes you think of, I don't want to say your job, but this area that you work in, that your work is incredibly helpful, and I appreciate the work you guys are doing. I love the management our tribe's doing to protect first foods and to protect just like what Amanda was capturing just now, the grasses, the native grasses, and giving them the space they need to grow and make it through the summer. So any reflections on your travels as they compare to where you work here on this homeland?
Doing traveling lately.
I think I'm a homebody, Althea. I don't travel much outside of here anymore because I like it so much.
Be a good reflection question. Yeah, I know that you might have people who need to consider that thought a little bit. And if anybody's online that wants to answer that, I would welcome that. I do see Andrew Wildbill, your hand is up. We'll get to you. We haven't ignored you. It's always interesting, I think, going to Indigenous communities. So the one real couple travel opportunities that I've had in life, I hate traveling. I hate traveling so much. But I have been able to see some of the tropics in Costa Rica and Panama. And then I was out in Minnesota, like Midwest, most recently. And so both of those, I had opportunities to visit with tribal people. Thank you, Lindsay, for being here. Have a great rest of your day. And so it was amazing to see tribal people in all these different areas, just be firmly rooted in the land wherever they were. And so it didn't matter necessarily what was going on around them. That preservation of culture, and especially the language, that connection of language really keeps that cultural connection fluid and alive. And so that's something that I've seen, is really making sure that the language that we have to have these conversations, even because something that we see with the climate crisis is the language starts to break down. We talk about 100-year flood events, 500-year flood events, and those labels mean nothing anymore because they're not 100 years, they're not 500 years. And the idea of what is an invasive species, what is a native species, when things are moving, we cannot necessarily have static definitions for these things when conditions are changing so much. And so making sure that the language is keeping up with what we are observing on the ground is something that I have seen in my travels. Andrew, we would love to hear from you. What you got? Still muted. Perfect.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna share that tribal hunters, a great example is our bison hunt. The bison hunt started in 2011, and in the first 4 years, you could bet on going over to Gardner or West Yellowstone in December, January, and there would be a good snow season by then to push the animals out of Yellowstone National Park. For the past 5 years, a lot of tribal hunters who were used to that, early, season hunt had to move their hunting back, 3 months. And the Fish and Wildlife Commission has, they've changed the season to go to bison. It used to end February 28th, and they shifted it back an extra month to give tribal members an extra opportunity. Because in the past, that deep snow that's needed to push bison out of Yellowstone National Park has come later and later. And in like, I want to say in like 2019, they didn't hardly get any snow, so there wasn't much of a bison season. You could say the same thing about last year's season. So over the years lately, that bison hunt has shifted from December, January to February, March. So I just wanted to share that from a wildlife perspective, that bison hunt. And in years past, when we haven't had a very good winter around the reservation, the Fish and Wildlife Commission has issued a late season hunt for elk and deer. That hasn't happened for a while. I don't remember the last year that did happen, but the Fish and Wildlife Commission has been fluid in changing seasons to give tribal members an opportunity. I just wanted to share that briefly.
Yeah, that was great. If you could stay on the line, I would love to know if you have seen state and national agencies clue into that, or if there's still some work that could be done with other outside non-tribal entities. Muted. Oh, perfect.
There's definitely a lot of stuff, but I just wanted to share that, Lindsay and I were talking this morning. The Fish and Wildlife Commission, they have a very brief mention of gathering in the code, and I'm going to post that in the chat here in a second. But I feel like with Cheryl and Thea on this, as gatherers, like, how do you think the tribe should try to, create policy, and what committee or commission should be created to implement that policy, and speak for the gatherers, because it's such a overlooked group of individuals right now. And I just want to say, if we don't outlaw raking, I mean, policing raking huckleberries is going to be hard, but if we don't outlaw it, at least show the tribal members who are going to use rakes how to use them right and when to use them, so that they're not going to harm the bushes. So
I guess I'd like to respond. When Range Ag and Forestry first became part of Department of Natural Resources, Eric Quibbs had recommended that a committee or commission be formed. I wish Lindsay was still on here to hear this. Requested the board to create that so it could address, the women's foods in the range. And so I think that's something that we should probably push again, that committee or commission be created to protect those resources. And it was declined, and that was back, I think the mid 2000s, 2005, 2007, in that area. I agree, and I think that's something that maybe we bring up again to Eric and to the current board for discussion.
Did anybody else want to either respond to the idea of changing regulations, committees to guide, or any lingering thoughts? We are approaching the end of our time together. Althea in the chat says, thank you, RAF and wildlife staff, for being our stewards in the land. We are all in good hands with you. Keep up the good work. Thank you guys for the work you do.
I
Does
just,
anyone
I just wanted to clarify that the gatherer protocols that are being circulated amongst staff are only protocols. They're not meant to regulate. They're basically a way for us to give to, for example, the gathering excursions. They're meant to be a tool to be for people to use. It's not realistic to try to enforce gatherer protocols. And it's also something a piece of paper we want to utilize to tell people their best learning is going to be in person and with other gatherers who have been gathering for a long time. And at the Health Commission meeting, when this was brought up, we did tell, even just in our commissioner circle, going out with the women is the best way to learn how to become a gatherer and gather appropriately. Because I started gathering in the 80s and my teachers have changed since then, obviously, to now starting to gather again, because I was raising kids for the better part of the last 15 years and I wasn't able to go back to gathering consistently like I used to. And they do gather differently now than they did back then. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I'm gathering a new way. And I continue to gather the way I was taught back then. And it's a very open and broad circle of women and teachers to learn from. And I recommend it all the time as much as possible, because that they're the best teachers is this group of women. And none of us know it all. We all bounce ideas off of each other. So again, it's not something to enforce or anything. It's just something we're gonna try to get prepared for those gathering excursions. So there's some advisory to people who want to do it without staff on their own.
And I think we're gonna plan that conversation greater depth in June. So that's something that we're looking at, having our June program be is some of those gatherers conversations, those best practices. Thank you, Andrew, for putting that in the chat. Not necessarily gonna read it out. So unless anyone, this is the last chance for lingering questions, lingering commentary. I'm gonna throw up our last slide, which is just sharing out information about the next thing that we're doing. So, Carol, I'd love your final reflections on the day. This, what work is ahead of us?
In regards to women's foods or?
In the changing climate.
Yeah, I think we have, I think we're going to see changes, but I still think that our work and as tribal members that we're going to still see resiliency in the plants. We've been gathering them for thousands of years, and I still think that we'll continue to gather them in the future. It's just going to be the work that the staff does here for the tribe. And as tribal members of Manage and Landscape ourselves, so we need to be out there gathering these foods for them to continue to be out there landscape. But, you know, I think that we need to put the work in, but that there will be positive benefits in the future. I want to stay positive. I don't want to end on a negative note, but I think that as staff managing the resources and as tribal members continue to go out there and gather and manage those resources ourselves, that continue to be resilient with our foods and as our culture as well.
Absolutely. First foods are climate resilient, and more than we can do to come back to them, the better off we will. So we are at our end of the day together. Thank you so much for being here. I again want to plug tomorrow in this very same room in the afternoon, we will be talking about carbon dioxide removal. So basically the exact opposite of this conversation today. We will be talking about administration thought was a good idea to drop on all of us. We have opportunities to talk about how do we actively pull carbon out of the air, both through natural solutions and some of those more engineered solutions. We'll be joined by the Global Ocean Health Building Tribal Leadership representatives for that tomorrow. So please tune in. And then 2 weeks from now, Cheryl is going to have an amazing presentation, April 26th in the afternoon. We're excited to welcome her and her team, not this room, but the room across the rotunda. And then we'll have hands-on activities in the rotunda as well. So that will be a little bit more of a fun day. But I'm very glad for the knowledge that we have had here today. Thank you for being with us. Cheryl, anything that you wanted to drop for your thing on 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, just hope people will attend. We'll discuss our pollinator project that we've been working on for the past few years. And then our first remonitoring that this is our second year doing that. So but everybody will attend. It will be some great information to that.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. So I release you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all the work that you do and continuing to be involved with it, both online and in person. We really appreciate you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Colleen.
For coming, Annie. Learn anything?
Oh, yeah.
Any lingering questions?
Yeah, I don't think we have met.
I know I've seen everybody's names on all the internal reviews. I'm Annie, I'm the new